will depend on a lot of things. It'll be fun. I'm interested.
All right, this thing on. Hello, everyone. We ask you to get seated now. We're about to get started. I'm Zach Graves, head of policy at Lincoln Network, which is a free market innovation policy group that works to help bridge the gap between Silicon Valley and DC. I've been working on this issue of building science and tech capacity and expertise in Congress for a little while now, starting in my previous role at the R Street Institute. We helped, advocate for getting a major study done to address some of the capacity gaps in Congress, which has now recently been released, and they're going to talk about it in a minute, from the National Academy of Public Administration. And I think it's a really interesting time. There's a bunch of action on the Hill happening. There's several bipartisan, bicameral actions that have happened. GAO has recently moved to build its S&T capacity, which you'll hear about later. And so it's a really good time to have this conversation. We hope you find it timely and productive.
Thanks, Zach, and it's great to co-host this with the Lincoln Network. My name is Franz Werfmann-Silber. I'm a senior advisor at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I think one of the key things we want to get across by today's event is just opportunity, that there is a real opportunity to advance the idea, advance the discussion on Capitol Hill, that in some ways there's been a growing perceived perception that there is a science and technology knowledge desert on Capitol Hill on some of these topics. Certainly the GAO, the CRS have been doing quite a lot, but there is a real feeling on both sides of the aisle that there needs to be more, that there are real benefits to the average citizen, to taxpayers, to the media who are covering Capitol Hill, for industry, for civil society organizations, to better engage when this is in place. In some ways, this discussion, for those who have been actively involved, has looked at, we need more fruits, we need more vegetables. And if you think about a food desert, we should be thinking about that, but thinking through that we could actually have both of those and start working through some of the details. So have a second opportunity here, which is to introduce Dr. John Tucker. He is a project director and senior analyst at NAPA. John was very actively involved in the work of the National Academy product that we're going to be talking about today. Previously, he has been affiliated with a number of organizations: Battelle, the NRC, NIST, New York State Department of Economic Development. He's worked on projects that cover 17 federal agencies, and he got his PhD from George Mason with a concentration in science and technology policy. So again, we very much welcome you here today, and we look forward to Dr. Tucker's presentation.
Thank you. We really appreciate the opportunity to present on this report in front of such an important forum on such an important topic. Before I get going on this, dive into the substance, I would like to recognize that this is the work of an Academy panel, and really thank the Academy Fellows serving on this panel for their guidance and insight on carrying out this very challenging study, in particular the stellar role of the chair in bringing this august body to a consensus recommendation. And I just want to recognize the project director on this, Roger Kodat. Back up. I have put the scope here just as a quick reminder of what we are asked to do. I'm not going to belabor this since I'm sure you're all quite familiar with it. I'll only add that in the statement of work and the contract with CRS, they refined this somewhat to include exploring the option of building on existing legislative branch support agencies and comparing that with the separate agency option. With that, I will dive into our approach, highlight a few aspects. First, we really did our best we really wanted to hear directly from members and staff about what they felt they needed. And so we tried to talk to as many of those folks who were available. Second, we developed a taxonomy of needs based on congressional customer input, but also expert perspective and the experience of our own panel. We took seriously the option of reviving OTA, at least in some form, appropriate to today's circumstances. We, as well as, of course, building on existing legislative branches, agencies as an option. We drew on best practices in institutional design. We developed criteria to help ensure that we provided a consistent evaluation of the options. And finally, we looked at the demand and the supply side. We realized early on in the project that whatever option we might come up with to improve supply, if the Congress is unable to absorb and utilize that work effectively, then it's not to say it won't be a failure, but to fully realize the potential of any option, that improvements should be made on that score. Up is down, down is up. Okay, going forward. Right, so the taxonomy. We developed regrouped S&T policy support into 6 types. Quick turnaround support, which encompasses everything from answering quick questions on the phone to developing written products. This is sort of the type of interaction, type of work associated with CRS. As you know, they provide a range of service along that continuum. Networking support, which means basically helping committees, members, and staff connect with experts as needed, such as identifying the right people for a hearing or a briefing on a topic. Consultative support, which can include sort of ongoing confidential support, much of the type you commonly associate with CRS, as well as private briefings and testimony on ongoing and completed projects, which is often the type of consultative support GAO provides. And then 3 types of reports. First, technology assessments. As you all know, sort of assessing social and policy implications of scientific and technical developments, providing options around that. Traditionally, these are longer-term comprehensive efforts taking between 12 and 24 months. These are still needed, maybe not 24 months, but these longer-term efforts are still needed, but it's really important for these to be complemented by shorter-term products that can provide credible, useful guidance on S&T issues for Congress in a time frame that's going to make sense for them. And then lastly, we have horizon scanning, as it sounds, looking out at emerging scientific and technical developments that have the potential to have significant social and possibly policy implications. I'm going to get this right. Okay. So that brings us to the panel's recommendation. The panel offers a integrated 3-part solution. I'll provide a high-level overview of this recommendation, and then I will follow up with some more detail on its component parts. So first, enhancing. We chose an option that is built on enhancing existing entities, CRS and GAO. In this recommendation, CRS and GAO would take action to expand and improve the S&T support they provide in the identified areas with the appropriate resources and authorizations from Congress. Second, Congress would create what we're calling the Office of the Congressional Science and Technology Advisor, what we're calling OCSTA, and I think we'll have a little competition to see if we can come up with a better acronym. I think that was my job. I was charged by the panel with this, and I failed utterly. The OCSTA is intended to play 3 major roles. One is to work collaboratively with Congress on initiatives to strengthen congressional absorption capacity. It's really their primary focus. Also to help ensure coordination between GAO and CRS to avoid unnecessary duplication of effort. And third, to perform the horizon scanning function. The third element would be to conduct a review of the performance of this option at the end of a 2-year period. Moving along, we move to go into a little bit more detail about the first component, actions by CRS and GAO. So in this in this recommendation, CRS would continue to provide quick turnaround and consultative support to all members and staff while building up its capability to offer these services in S&T domains. GAO would focus on strengthening its capabilities in performing TAs and providing short and medium-term reports. In addition, GAO should take the lead in providing networking support to Congress. Toward these ends, the panel recommends that GAO take action in 5 areas. First would be to create a core team focused on performing TAs and short to medium-term reports. Given long-standing concerns about GAO's ability to, long-standing concerns about sort of the cultural difference. I think that sort of one of the critiques of GAO is this cultural difference between doing audits and TAs. So acknowledging that, the panel believes that it's critical to establish some degree of separation between these functions to cultivate a distinctive culture around this new function. At the same time, the panel did not want to hem GAO in too much. We want to give them flexibility to propose to Congress a way to best address this concern. Second, continue to refine its TA methodology, including the expanded use of peer review to ensure the quality of TAs, and making more extensive use of external expertise to more quickly produce the desired products. What I'm referring to is some form of a network model that you see in Europe, to experiment with that, possibly ask for additional authorizations if needed to carry that out. Third, develop its methodology for short to medium term studies, short to medium term reports. And in this regard, the panel has urged GAO to engage, to look at the models in other countries, namely the UK POST, that is the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, that we reference this with regard to their notes, so the short to medium term products that we found a useful reference. Fourth, continue to build its relationship with S&T communities and work with CRS and NASEM to ensure that Congress has timely and effective access to the expertise as needed. And fifth, continue its use of existing congressional protocols for accepting and prioritizing study requests from committees. Also continuing to provide quick turnaround and consultative support to all members and staff related to its ongoing and completed work. The second element of the recommendation, OCSTA, the Office of Congressional Science and Technology Advice. This office would be led by the Congressional S&T advisor appointed by the House and Senate leaders. The advisor should be an eminent person within the S&T community with a reputation and relationships to be able to engage to tap the resources and support across government, universities, and the private sector. This would be a relatively small, a modest-sized organization, up to 10 FTE, with a modest budget of $5 million or so to start. Of course, staffing and budget could be revisited at the end of the two-year review period. The three major I'll go into a little bit more detail on the 3 roles we discussed for that group, for that office. One is that it will be focused on enhancing efforts to enhance the capacity of Congress, absorption capacity. And this anticipates some recommendations in the report in Chapter 6 about what Congress can do to enhance its absorption capacity. One of those recommendations is for committees to bring on S&T advisors, the major committees. And connecting with that, the office, one of the major things it would be doing to enhance absorptive capacity would be to help committees identify and recruit folks for that role. They would not be hiring them. That would still be the prerogative of the committee, but they would help facilitate that process. Coordination. Through the Congressional S&T Coordinating Council, chaired by the advisor, the office would help ensure coordination between CRS and GAO. They already coordinate. We didn't identify some big coordination problem, but in the context of their more expansive and innovative roles that are being recommended by the panel, we thought it important to have that role. And then finally, the office could play an ombudsman role, helping congressional customers as needed to navigate available services and identify appropriate resources within or even outside the legislative branch if need be. And I just want to note here that this office would not be directing the work of GRS and GAO and CRS, but they would be having conversations about what is needed and identifying resources, helping identify resources. Third, the horizon scanning function, OXTA would be overseeing that, supervising that, but they would be contracting out externally for the performance of that function and the development of the reports for Congress. Still, the office would still need to have significant staff and resources and authority to perform that function effectively. The final element, very important, the panel really felt it was important to ensure that there was an opportunity to evaluate the progress of this option within a fairly brief period of time to sort of underline the urgency of this. And so we provide for that after 24 months. I'm not going to get into the specifics of that evaluation right now. I'll move that along and we can talk about that later. Finally, I just want to emphasize that we seriously considered other options. First, creating a new agency, and I'll just at a high level talk about some of the pros and cons that we considered. With regard to creating a new agency, first, there's just the cost and uncertainty of building a whole new organization from scratch. Two, a separate agency devoted to S&T issues would lack a broad constituency, even if it were to provide services to individual members, which would be a way to broaden that constituency. We believe it would still struggle to be considered an essential function like budgeting or taxation or oversight, and would be vulnerable as OTA was in the past. A strong positive would be an organization devoted to S&T support. Obviously, it would have the benefit of focus. It would presumably be better positioned to attract talent and engage S&T communities. Enhancing existing entities, the other option considered. And by that, I just mean only enhancing GAO and CRS without the OXTA piece. Obviously, it'd be less costly, less uncertain in terms of building within existing organizations, and placing this function within an established organization with a broad constituency, organizations with broad constituencies, it'd be less vulnerable it would have less vulnerability, as discussed before. Negatives would be, I think the panel acknowledged and took seriously the concerns about GAO culture, and they did not agree that that was insurmountable, but they acknowledged that these concerns might inhibit the agency's efforts, at least initially, but strongly believed that the GAO could take action to address those concerns. And on a last note on this option would be that it would be somewhat less feasible and slightly less desirable than the chosen option insofar as it wouldn't have that added focus on absorption capacity. Finally, and I think I've been running ahead of my slides, so I apologize. Yes. So finally, recommendations to Congress to strengthen its absorptive capacity. We identified recommendations in three broad areas: committee structure and activities, staffing, and proceedings. So under the first, the panel recommended that every major committee should consider hiring an S&T advisor, and that committees should also, in some cases, consider establishing technical advisory groups with the Intelligence Committee as a possible model. Staffing, more congressional offices should take advantage of AAAS and other S&T fellowship programs, as well as federal detailees. Of course, these are only temporary positions, and so it's also important for the purposes of continuity to look at their personnel system to see if there are ways to make congressional staff careers more attractive for those with S&T backgrounds. And finally, on proceedings, this may sound crazy, but should try to carve out more time for hearings and floor debate. Just excellent vehicles for gathering information and exploring issues. And finally, we recommended that whatever path Congress chose, that they should enshrine this within legislation to codify its decisions. And we thought, the discussion that would entail would be good in and of itself to raise attention to these issues. And I hope I'm within my 20 minutes and can now take some questions.
Thanks for that presentation. I know a lot of people have been very actively involved in the discussion, so I was wondering if anyone in the audience has any questions. So I'll kick it off with a question, which is, I know you mentioned the absorptive capacity for Congress to take this up. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations on how you can actually increase the understanding or the awareness of staff, offices, members of the types of resources that are available for science and tech from GAO, CRS, or elsewhere? Like practical ways that members could learn more about that.
Well, one not very ambitious way, but it's built into the routine, right? CRS and GAO interact with Congress in all sorts of ways, and testimony, their individual dealings with staff and members. So it seems to me that both those organizations could build into those interactions a certain information about the range of things that they can offer, and just make that make that clear to folks in all those various interactions, and that will work over time. It's not a big press release, hey, we're doing something new, but that's obviously something they could do as well. And of course, all those good folks out there who favor this sort of thing could be starting to make folks aware that that's the path being taken, assuming it even goes forward.
So one of the things you talk about is building capacity. One of the things you talk about is beefing up capacity at CRS as one of the options for enhancing some of the shorter form rapid response. I'm curious what you see as the sort of primary gaps in what their current capabilities are. I know the report mentioned there were some constraints in evaluating their capabilities.
I'm sorry, could you?
CRS.
Give me that question one more time.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you could talk about any specifics about where you think the needs are in beefing up S&T capacity expertise at CRS, given that the report mentioned there were some constraints on evaluating their capabilities.
Right. So their service model is great. What we're saying is that there's an opportunity to beef up their staffing in terms of scientific and technical expertise. I mean, they have folks with that expertise. They are operating, but they have a limited staff in that area. So there's opportunity to simply build that staff based on an assessment of anticipated needs. I don't think I'd be more specific than that.
Got it.
It's not really a change in how they do things.
I mean, you mentioned, for instance, there was a reorg in the past where there's a sort of S&T division that was merged into another research division. Is that something you've considered, whether that'd be good to change back or not?
We did not explicitly consider that in the report. We didn't want to specifically get into how CRS ought to structure itself, simply that capability would need to be strengthened. How they chose to organize it would be their discretion.
What do you see as the relationship between the short-term reports, the tech assessment reports, and the horizon scanning reports among the different organizations?
Seems to be two. Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. Right. So the horizon scanning would be done on the reports on the horizon scanning function would be done on a yearly basis, but it's anticipated that more timely, near-term products might be provided in the near term on that activity. There are a number of ways you could do that to make that work more accessible and usable on the Hill. But how that relates to the short and medium-term products, those would be driven by congressional customers, right? So the timing is, you have a function that's going to happen on an annual basis no matter what, and then you've got congressionally driven requested products, which are going to be shorter, medium, longer term, so there would be overlapping. So they wouldn't necessarily be synced, but presumably be drawing on the insights from the horizon scanning that's ongoing, if that answers your question.
In your work, did you differentiate, thank you, did you differentiate between the needs, for example, for actual science and technology knowledge as opposed to the policies related to science and technology policy? Say the difference between building a nuclear weapon and how you might use it on a battlefield?
Right, so doing a good technology assessment is not just about having a bunch of scientists and engineers, right? You've got to have the scientific technical background, but you've also got to have some appreciation, understanding of policy design. If you're going to come up with a credible policy option in response to the implications you've identified, you've got to have social sciences skills and background to think through the social implications, possible policy implications. So it's a well-rounded team, not just hiring a bunch of S&T advisors, S&T scientists and engineers. Yes.
Okay. So I was wondering if during your assessment process and the panel process, you all thought explicitly about the public's role in forming science and technology policy as well. In Europe, we see some of these models with these citizen assemblies, in China more explicitly bring the public into these decisions. Did you all consider building that into any of these different organizations, or consider it at all?
Well, we certainly considered it, and we interviewed a number of folks who were advocates of that dimension of technology assessment. We chose not to get into that level of detail in terms of identifying how technology assessment would be done, leaving that to be determined.
So this kind of alludes to a previous question. Did you guys do any insight or introspection into the actual use? So you have all of these great products. Is there any anecdotal evidence or any insight into getting Congress and the staff, if you produce great S&T advice and TA, to actually utilize it, being GAO, CRS, or a reactive, staff asks them to do things? Is there any proactive aspect to any of this that you think if we do a report, we can reach out to staff to get them to use this before decisions are made to better inform them?
You mean doing reports independently of a request?
Yeah, and doing proactive outreach. So like if you do a report that's salient on a number of topics, identifying people who would best use that so that they're better informed when those things come to a vote or to a critical decision.
We are certainly aware of how how that has been done in the past. That OTA did in some cases identify topics and pursue them with some discretion, and make them available. We did not specifically look at it as an option, as part of our option for what GAO and CRS and how they might operate. We did, in the report, we only addressed, the requested model, but we did not close that door. And certainly, there are many ways that one could cultivate support for that type of work.
In another context, it's been pointed out that congressional clients quite often are unhappy with estimates and statistical ranges and prefer points or definitive statements. When we're talking about what you're talking about here, quite often there are going to be probabilities and the like. And what will be the response of the clients to that? I'm actually using the language in this for the CBO case, where there's been a long-standing question about whether CBO should provide fan charts and ranges rather than 2 points or 3 points for their projections of deficits and scoring. But this also applies, obviously, to technology assessments and something like climate change, which is clearly there's a particular probability that something will happen, but there's also tails and stuff like that.
I'm not, I mean, it sounds like a generic problem that, yeah, you're noting a generic problem in dealing with that customer. I guess I can't speak specifically to that.
I'll throw one more in, which is you made some recommendations to the need for science and technology advisors on committees, and that the OXTA could help with that. Was there a recognition of the limitations that sometimes committees have with committee budgets, with committee space, and how that would do, recognizing some of the jurisdictional limits that they have? So the sort of special circumstances committees have in being able to absorb some of these additional folks.
Right, so like in so many things, I think it would be a matter of targets of opportunity. I mean, not all committees are going to be equally interested in pursuing this route. But for those who are, I think the role of the OXTA would be to make that as easy as possible for them to do it. You know, you go with those who are willing and help them out.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. We appreciate the report, and we can have a conversation afterwards as well. So thanks.
Thanks.
Now we have Dr. Robert Cook-Dean and Dr. Tim Persons for a panel discussion.
Zach, did you want to say anything?
So I'm Bob Cook-Deegan, and full disclosure, I came to Washington on a AAAS fellowship, and my first assignment was at the Office of Technology Assessment. May it rest in peace. And I'm now a professor at Arizona State University, and we've been following this space as the attention being devoted to improving science and technology advice to the first branch, that is Congress, has really ramped up in a way that I don't understand completely, frankly, over the last 2 years. I know that the National Academy of Sciences has at least 2 units that are thinking about how do we go about detecting and thinking about emerging technologies. The Hastings Center and many of my colleagues in bioethics are thinking about this much more intensively. We have the beefing up of the General Accounting Office. We have $6 million put in the House Appropriations Bill this year for the first time. We don't know what's going to happen after the continuing resolution, which expires when? Tomorrow. We'll see what happens. But obviously there's something in the air about improving the quality of information about science, technology, and medicine going into the first branch of our federal government. I wanted to set the context a little bit, and Dr. Tucker did a nice job of kind of summarizing what the Napa report, and as far as I know, this is the first public event. I guess there was a Hill briefing yesterday about the Napa report, but I think this is the first kind of public event that's happened since the Napa report came out last week. So it's an opportunity to think about what should we do. And I think the context into which the report is entering the world is worth emphasizing a bit. It's kind of depressing, the first chapter. The first chapter is all about the diminution of expertise and the concentration of power out of the committee structures and towards the leadership. And this has happened in both parties, and it's happened for 20 years. And the reduction in staffing, the reduction in expertise at the level of the support agencies, all 4 of them, one of which was killed, which was OTA. And that kind of sets the context at precisely the moment. I mean, remember, the November 1994 revolution that gave rise to the death of OTA happened within months of Tim Berners-Lee at CERN forming the W3C, the first governance structure for the World Wide Web, which was a huge jump, changed our world profoundly. And at precisely that moment, Congress decided to perform a lobotomy on itself precisely when the frontal lobe functions of executive control and thinking were most needed for our country. And what we've been doing is sliding downhill. And the first chapter of this report shows that slide that began at more or less that time. So we've got a real problem. I think we're here to think about several solutions to that. And there are two components to that solution. One is to have units that actually take responsibility for doing the analysis, and doing that analysis and then presenting it to policymakers in a way that they can use it. So that's function one. Function two is to have a receptor that's open to actually receiving that knowledge and doing something with it. And in the report, that's classified as absorptive capacity, kind of borrowing from the B-school lingo. That's, I think, a harder nut to crack, and I'm actually less optimistic about being able to do something about that problem in the short term, because I think we're going to continue to see this drift of power towards the leadership of both houses, given the incredible polarization of Congress over the last 2 decades. So that is a context, but we can do something about the first problem, which is beefing up the capacity for doing this analysis. And the options that were laid out were basically GAO already, and I want to turn to you, Tim, to talk about what GAO, how are you thinking about responding to this report? My reading of it basically says, hey, you're doing a good job, it's a good idea to beef this up. The one caution, that the yellow light was on this feature of foresight and emerging technology stuff. And I guess from the political science perspective, it strikes me that what we're trying to create in this analytical capacity is a boundary organization that has to keep 2 categories of masters happy at all times. One is the Congress, its client. And expertise about the committee structure and the power structures within Congress, which has been tribal since the very beginning of our country. It's always been tribal, and it's only intensified over the last 20 years. And then there's the external constituencies of science and technology. I think OTA was really, really good at that and had high prestige among the external constituencies, maybe less actually on the congressional side, and that was its vulnerability. But it seems like GAO is kind of the reverse. It's really, really good at meeting the auditing needs and are you playing by the rules analysis that Congress has come to expect from GAO, but maybe less on the external constituencies, the credibility, the peer review. So I'm sure you're thinking a lot about that. So what's your take on what happens at GAO from this point forward?
Yeah, no, thanks, Bob. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Persons. I'm the Chief Scientist of GAO and its Managing Director for our newest team, the Science, Technology Assessment and Analytics team. So we literally now have a team with TA as the middle name. That's a big thing. It will continue to be a big thing. Just in terms of GAO, for those of you who don't know, we've been Bob mentioned the old acronym was General Accounting Office, and we've since changed since 2004 to the Government Accountability Office. And I think that's subtle and nuanced, but I think it's significant because really what GAO has evolved into over time, yes, is about audits. We are indeed the supreme audit institution of the United States. We have extraordinary access powers to help Congress in its oversight functions under Article 1 and so on. But we also have an insight and foresight mission that we've been doing, which I'll speak to, and TA is part of that. And you mentioned horizon scanning, I'll mention that as well. But I think that I like the way the Comptroller General, the previous one, Dave Walker, just described GAO, saying we just happen to be a world-class professional services organization that just happens to be in the government, in this case, the ledge branch. So really, we're pulling things out from the direction of GAO is an apparatus to do oversight, insight, foresight that Congress can but be burdened to ask the questions or things that are on its mind in its way. And to the question earlier, is there space to be able to be more prospective rather than just reactive alone? I think the answer is yes. In GAO's history, we have evolved from the CPA financial auditing in the 1921. We're almost a century old now. CRS is older. We're, I guess, maybe the next oldest ledge branch agency coming through, and we have really in the 70s started doing the performance auditing. That's become 85% of our work, and TA is sort of taking as another professional service that we're doing, sort of that evolutionary pathway. We've been in TA, by the way, for almost 2 decades. It's not brand new to us on that, and we certainly have had a lot of help from our friends doing it. But one of the things, just building on your comments about the NAPA report, I particularly appreciated NAPA. I even love the word absorptive because that's scientific itself, so that was cool. But also the idea of how do you do it on the receiving end, because one of my colleagues, an ex-OTA, was saying that Congress, and I agree with this, Congress is the most advised body in the world. Not just in the U.S., the world. Lots of people are telling Congress what to do, so a lot of inputs in that. The issue might be the quality of the inputs, the nonpartisan, the fact-based nature of the inputs, et cetera. But the absorptive side, I thought, was very, very powerful, and I really appreciate NAPA's singular view on that, and also starting from tabula rasa, just saying we're not presupposing things walking in about things, we're just saying what are the needs, what are the gaps. You mentioned horizon scanning. GAO has and is doing that. A lot of the things that John was talking about in those things, it's just a matter of the emphasis and the extent to which we're known about it, to your point about being able to connect in with the scientists. We now have, for example, a Center for Strategic Foresight that's run by our managing director for strategic planning, external liaison, James Christian Blockwood, who's here. But we're partnering with him. He did some work with his team on deep fakes, for example, and we're taking that and turning that into work that's in that short and medium turnaround type piece on that. So there's evolution in TA methodology. We just are about to, hopefully in a few weeks, put out a designing TA handbook just on how you might do it. It does involve connectivity with the world's actors and players on that, which includes entities in Europe and things. It's not going to particularly focus on, let's say, participatory TA or any single method, but just the design is important, because really what I also like about NAPA is let's think about functions and outcomes. What does Congress need, and how do we do that? And how do we have, I think, a right balance of what we're pushing forward, but also what we're there to answer to. GAO is growing its staff. We're aspirationally moving in STAA toward an FTE count of 140 staff, and that's not going to count the augmentation that we want to have with the AAAS program or the Tech Congress Fellows or the university system or what have you. And it's going to build on the policy expertise that we already have in GAO. Not all scientists and engineers are within STAA, and that's a good thing. We have a team that does nuclear weapons things that can tell you the difference between a mod and on a weapon tail, that can tell you about the B-61 Mod 11, that can tell you about the W-84 life extension program, right? We can talk about cementitious versus glass program at Hanford site and so on. We have true nuclear scientists, we have life scientists, we have information technology expertise. So that's just in that piece. We also have the Comptroller General has renamed our decades-old information technology team to add a C to it. It's called Information Technology and Cybersecurity. So we're covering that particular piece. Again, we're about in the mid to upper 70s, aspirationally doubling to 140, and up to a third of our staff have PhDs in the sciences on STAA, and then we have probably 80% of our staff are masters in that. So there are true scientists and engineers and things and technical experts in Congress. We're there for picking up the phone for phone calls, again, in complement to what CRS does with its nice close relationship, all the way up to helping prep for hearings. And then now, as John mentioned, short-term, medium, we were doing these single one-pager explainers on things really across the taxonomy of sciences like bioinfo, nano, on things ranging from opioid vaccine to probabilistic genotyping software, hypersonic weapons, and then blockchain. And I'll just say on the medium-sized work that we're now doing, Mr. Takano, who's a big proponent of technology assessment for the Congress, has asked us to do that intermediate 6-month type work for probabilistic genomic or computational forensic systems to help out in the judicial system. In other words, how are constitutional due process rights preserved when you have black boxes if I'm trying to ascribe guilt in a court of law. So it's actually a very interesting time with machine learning, face recognition, PGS software, et cetera. Lots of things going on, but that's a start to the question, but we'll move on.
So one question that occurred to me as I was reading through the report is there are 2 components to the recommendations that came out of the NAPA report. One is about the unit itself, and the other is about restructuring Congress. And I've expressed my pessimism that that Congress is actually going to increase its absorptive capacity in the short term. But that doesn't mean that they can't do anything. And one of the insights, I think, from the report is that, in a way, whatever this little gem that is created in our first branch that does the S&T analysis needs some air cover. It needs some patrons in Congress who have this as a primary responsibility, which the Technology Assessment Board did, and is probably needed. And I think that was actually quite a useful insight. And the other key insight is it's not like there are no scientists on the Hill. The AAAS has been sending 30 fellows on the Hill. It's a fantastic resource, unbelievable network, fabulous. Rush, who's here, was a fellow. I was a fellow. Several other people in the room were fellows. It's a great way to get people with their toe in the water and get them into Washington. There's the Robert Wood Johnson Fellows for Health Policy. There's the Tech Congress Fellows. There are the APSA Fellows. Those are all one-year wonders, though. That is very limited capacity that is only there for a short time, not even a full legislative cycle. And it's the level above that where there hasn't been any air cover since 1995. Sure. And it strikes me as that's worth at least as much attention as whichever unit ends up doing this, whether it's reviving OTA, beefing up GAO, or both. And do you have any sense of how you all are thinking about interacting with a new structure within the Congress and prospects of doing that?
Right. So our view and the Comptroller General's policy generally is we're building our capacity for science technology. If you hypothesize an OTA revival, we're still going to be doing things in that oversight, insight, foresight space for Congress. I don't think many would argue that there's not enough to do in this space. So I think part of that, along with CRS, if there was an OXTA, if there were an OTA, there's lots to do. So I like also what you're saying about the fellows. We've been hiring some of the AAAS fellows. We plan in the near future to try and host one into our agency on that to just build those sort of networks, because I think there's a nice elegance to having sort of a constant temporary or a constant permanent staff with long-term memories, but also some folks who can come in maybe under the Intergovernmental Personnel Mobility Act program or the IPA, who could come in from university for a time and work in our space, and then intentionally be designed to go back. NSF and DARPA do this. A lot of our science agencies are based on that. So our staffing model is this permanent plus this augmented staff, as well as networks that we can scale and span extensively. It's easy to say, hard to do. I've met with a number of university deans or science and tech type leadership in universities, and even ASU, which is a massive expanse. It would be, if you were the dean, Bob, I would say, Bob, who do I call?
Never going to happen, guys.
Right. who do I call, Bob, on this question? It's much more complicated because the campus is an ecosystem of a lot of essentially small businesses, if you will. But in any case, that's the kind of thing that we do want to try and get that to help provide organic answers, to be as real time as we can if necessary, but also to do that longer term work where you need to do that key deep analysis. John mentioned POST. That's an elegant, we're very close there. There are British counterparts in Westminster, and they do the 4-page POST notes. In large part, this was somewhat modeled on that. This is just a 1-pager, technically too, front and back, but it is nice to have that particular work. But we think there's also a spectrum for doing longer term work where the analysis needs to be deeper, maybe at strategic issues, like do we stay in cement or glass in Hanford when there's billions and billions of dollars on the line? And how do we deal with that particular cleanup in the Pacific Northwest? Just as one example. So we think of things in a spectrum, and to help Congress wherever it is, again, both not only reactively to them, but also proactively in a way.
So one of the other things that caught my attention well, there are actually two that I wanted to mention that caught my attention out of the report. One was a quote from page 14 that I just can't resist quoting directly. And it was, potential interviewees on the Hill said they were simply too busy to speak with the study team, even when the study team highlighted that the focus of the report was designed to assist the Congress in undertaking its responsibilities on behalf of the American people. So here's a situation where science and technology is, if anything, the primary driver of economic growth for the last half century. And we're talking about beefing up the first branch's expertise in that area. And yet we've got people who are too busy to think about that or interact with a committee that's trying to help Congress think about what its priorities are. That kind of institutional arrogance is something that any of us who've ever worked on the Hill are used to. Frustrating, but real. And I think it's a cautionary signal that the absorptive capacity problem is going to be more severe than the create a unit to do the analysis problem. But it's also it's a problem that can be solved by enlightened leadership. And so that's just a side observation.
Can I chime in on this real quick? Just because there is hope, though. I understand that, and that's been an experience. It depends on the committee and how busy and that kind of thing. There is, however, interestingly, there is an appetite for foresight-oriented tech assessment. It's been requested officially.
Yep.
Actually, Franz is here. His former boss, Senator Coons, had asked for a key study we did for 3 senators, Senators Coons, Markey, and Collins, on sustainable chemistry. It was really about what if you could reboot the way we manufacture everything, like our clothes, the seats you're sitting on, everything, because chemistry covers everything. What if you could do that, but design it from ab initio with sustainability in mind, whether it's economic goodness, whether it's environmental and human health protection, all of that kind of thing. And that was a major strategic report, again, requested by a committee that said, we want to have some time to think, we want you to look at that. And what was pleasing about it was we think it did some good in terms of the Senate side, but recently one of the hearings, someone said more hearings is necessary. Yes, GAO does, like last cycle when we measure ourselves annually, we had up to 100 as an institution. We certainly are starting to do more on the science and tech piece. But for sustainable chemistry, it was a House side hearing. It was House Science, and this was to consider a bill, I believe, by Mr. Lipinski, who was interested in the Sustainable Chemistry Research Development Act. So these things are helping to help think. It's not saying here is the legislation that you should do, but it is saying here are the bounds or the parameters or what good policy options might say to say, you know, if your policy goal is X, here's going to be the upside downside. There's always a double-edged sword narrative. And so to try and do that and to see that come out to play in this particular hearing, resulting in an act, it's not like just our report did that, but I think we were invited by a committee that didn't even request the study to come out and do that.
Yeah, so, and of course, one of the other features of Congress is there are always good people who are paying attention to what's actually happening in the world, and that's the constituency whose needs we want to meet.
Right.
So I think I don't want to sound too pessimistic on that front. I just want to caution that short-term solutions may not be short-term.
That's right.
The other thing that caught my attention was this short-term, medium-term, long-term.
Right.
And speaking here about tradecraft and all that, it struck me always that you can actually do really, really short-term turnaround, but only after you actually have integrated yourself into a community and are organically part of a science and technology or medical or other highly technical community where the staff are respected as colleagues as opposed to being a level down from colleagues where, in fact, you can speak with some credibility, and that usually results from a longer-term immersion in that community. And you alluded to the NSF model of rotating, or the DARPA model of being fully integrated into a community. It strikes me that this short-term, long-term is kind of it was a ghost that haunted OTA the whole time that it existed. But in fact, OTA and the national academies are fully capable of quick stuff, but only when they've already got the staff on board. And it strikes me that in a way, that's kind of a false dichotomy.
Yeah. Well, and what's also pleasing is that, to that point, Bob, is even academia, because when I think like most PhDs, I did my PhD in biomedical engineering. When I came through, I didn't have anything part of my core curriculum having to do with public policy. And neither was it on the other end when I was getting ready to graduate. I have a professor sitting there saying, have you considered public service as a potential option? It's not even on the table, and we need to change that conversation in a macroscopic way. It's not anyone's fault or any one particular thing's burden, but it is a key need to do that. But the hope is that, and there's actually some promise in terms of what's going on where, like at Arizona State, having a nice fusion of sciences, engineering, and public policy. Carnegie Mellon has a strong program, right? MIT, UVA, you're seeing some things pop up on that to try and take what you're saying. That can come to life, as well as augmenting the AAAS type programs, as well as Tech Congress Fellows, again, to create the network, the common good that can help support potentially, ideally, the absorptive capacity that NAPA recommends.
So I see that I'm to open this up to the audience for questions, and while we're doing that, well, actually, I'll just do that right now instead of trying to do a segue. Questions for either of us from the audience? Yeah. If you could wait for the microphone.
I was just wondering how you think about the different ways that the more Foresight studies could be used. Like, if I'm going to think purely as a scientist, you can imagine some of these reports being used to rule out funding certain areas, other effects like that. And all of a sudden, you're not studying some random bacteria that happens to result in the discovery of CRISPR or something like that, or a different study that might inspire a few people to go into science who then go on to make really great discoveries. So just how do you think about the different ways these things could be used to potentially cut research funding programs and things like that?
Is that for Bob or both?
Well, why don't you go first and I'll go second. I definitely have an answer for that.
I'll just say, again, we actually have a small but capable, I think, growing unit within GAO on Foresight, and we're thinking passionately about that particular question, again, in the absorptive sense. I think there's a number of, there's actually a toolbox we got from our colleagues also in Westminster, which was called the Horizon Scanning Center, which works for the Chief Science Advisor for the UK, or the British Prime Minister. But some of these things are like modified Delphi methodology. Some of these things are scenario-based. I like what we've done, and if you look at our tech assessments recently, and then if you look at what our Center for Strategic Foresight is doing, we're really telling stories. This is the powerful way of saying, let's take a plausible scenario where you kind of take science fiction-y sounding things, but it's science fact, and project it forward, not in a way that tries to convey error bars that are down here and there's a certain path. This isn't about future prediction, but it is trying to say, let's speak in a way that opens the imagination in the policy context that the audience is expert in. Like, they own that particular area, they're very familiar with that. But how do we say, well, what would CRISPR do to the food supply, or what could that do? What problems could that solve? And if that were true, what would that do to our regulatory, how would we think about it through USDA or whatever else? And so if you place that in the context of what is the known, through sort of these scenario or storytelling, I think you can start to inspire more proactive thinking. Again, you'll always be wrong if you try and predict exactly. That won't happen. But I think you can speak into that space where the audience is expert in terms of generally the issues, but you can say, let's hypothesize CRISPR, what could that do? And that's, I think, the approach that works and that we're largely taking.
And I want to double click on the example that you gave, which is CRISPR. This is a technology that grew out of places that nobody's heard of, researchers that nobody had heard of, studying bacteria. And suddenly it emerges as an incredibly powerful technology for doing all sorts of things. If there had been an OTA, what would be different in the world? Well, number one, I think the Nuffield Council wouldn't have been the first organization that did a report on what's happening with CRISPR. And then the academies coming out with reports a year after Nuffield and 2 years after Nuffield. We would have probably had a report early on that's saying, hey, look what's going on in the world. And this looks like it's a really powerful technology. Mm-hmm. Also, in my own field, bioethics has just gone gangbusters on CRISPR. Mm-hmm. But what are they focusing on? They're focusing on embryo genomic editing, mm-hmm. which is, at the most optimistic, very, very unlikely to affect very many people ever, right, because of the clinical indications and the risks of making changes that survive all of embryogenesis without causing problems. Right. What should we be focusing on? We should be focusing on environmental and agricultural applications, mm-hmm. and intellectual property in this incredibly complicated world of commercial drive and what's going on in the real world. The world of biotechnology is hopelessly complicated with small units and big units, and we know that that's how this technology is going to evolve. Who's paying attention from Congress? You tell me. It would be nice to have some expertise and some people in that network who are highly expert about what's going on really on the ground with CRISPR, who are answering directly to members of Congress to tell them, hey, this is what's going to happen in 3 years. USDA is going to have to do something. EPA is going to have to do something, not just NIH and NSF funding the research.
Right. And I think just to your point also, I think by implication, these conversations demand in this space a cross-sectoral representation, meaning not just the government speaking to itself kind of thing. It means not just the universities, the academics. You need a nonprofit perspective. You certainly need the industry's perspective, and we want to roll all of that in on these studies. We take that sort of larger optic, holistic view, being able to craft scenarios and project them is a strong way to create a more prospective governance support structure than just a reactive one.
Yes? If you don't mind, if you could wait for the microphone so everybody can hear what your question is.
A bit concerned. I'm just a bit concerned hearing the word report so much during the morning session.
Sure.
And would prefer to hear something more about a continuous engagement on a platform that is updated on a regular basis. And
Great question. So in SDAA, we want to move from what we're calling the product-centered model, where it's you exhaust yourself to get a really high quality. We're not going to sacrifice GAO quality, but we want to move from product-centered or report type to a content-based, which includes dynamism, engagement, and things like that. So as a baby step, but nonetheless, it still is a step we've taken. Just last week, we issued our latest tech assessment is on irrigated agriculture. It's about freshwater management technologies. And it's really about the dialectical need to both conserve water and incentivize the need to essentially recharge aquifers, especially in water-stressed areas that are projected to only get worse in the context of climate change. So, but in that, there's a mapping, a geospatial element. We wanted to get down to with USDA and USGS information down to like the farm level. We want that active engagement. We also appended to that, we have a great public affairs unit, both agency-wide and then within our team, that helps us do things like podcasts and other multimedia type elements and structures and things that can be more tied to the operational tempo now of the way legislation processes are done, and using the technology of seeing members with their handsets, like say in a hearing going like this, whereas used to be for GAO, used to be a report with the big blue cover, right, which they would say like this, and the poor executive branch witness would be under assault from the chair or whatever the hard questions. But the blue cover is gone in that sense, just having fallen victim to that. But we do need to make that change. I think is an excellent question.
Yeah, bless your heart for that question, because that was actually what I had on my list as the next thing to address, which is since the demise of OTA, the whole field of technology assessment has shifted to participatory technology assessment, real-time technology assessment, and life cycle technology assessment. These are all much more interactive and mobile. So an OTA that exists right now would have had to move in its methodology forward, and whatever units we create are going to have to be much more sophisticated at the input end in public engagement and sampling what's going on in the world, and at the output end in communication and using different modes other than books. And so excellent question, and something that anybody in this space is going to have to evolve with the times.
Towards the end of the discussion, you were talking about sort of the pipeline for scientists coming into these kinds of roles and how that might expand. And it seems to me that the group's relying heavily on AAAS and other organizations to identify that. I'm just curious if, in order to engage a more broad array of scientists, if there are maybe advisory committees or other types of opportunities for people to get a sense of being involved in these kinds of things, maybe as an advisor or something where it's not like a full-time commitment, to kind of get that balance and range of expertise so they can develop it over time. Just wondering if you had any additional comments on that.
Excellent question. What I didn't say in terms of the detail of the answer, but having technical staff, like I'll use myself as an example, and then another colleague I have. I walk in with professional memberships. I'm a senior member of the IEEE, for example. So I've served on, like, as a government co-chair for their annual blockchain conference. So we can reach out through networks, whether it's IEEE USA, which is based here in DC, and or the overarching global membership of that. That's one example through the world's largest science society in that regard. When you get to the second one, I have now a newly appointed director she's an analytical chemist. She has her PhD. But she's a member of the American Chemical Society. So we've done the same thing, and through the ACS channels and their publications, there was actually an amplification of the messages out of Senator Coons's Sustainable Chemistry Report and things like that, and through that House hearing. And so augmentation and amplification through networks, whether they're academic or professional societies, is a key part of the strategy. And I think it's a great point. We want to figure out how to do that using the new media and reaching out and have that. It's not just those, it's plus and to all those things, as you're suggesting.
But I think you've identified a weak point in the ecosystem. The National Academies does have the Mirzayan Fellowship Program, and the CASE program at AAAS, which is it's a lower level than spending a whole year in Washington as a fellow. But just going back even to the AAAS, it's been stuck at 30 fellows on the congressional side. We're now at 250 total, but only 30 of those are on the Hill, and it's really, really hard to fund those. So that's a priority for that program, and it would be nice if that expanded. We could double that and still wouldn't meet the needs. We're only filling about a third of the open slots on the Hill. So that would be really good to open those spaces. But I have to tell you, this is a source of continual frustration. My students would love to get engaged with policy, and there aren't very many receptor nodes out there for them to latch onto. And it's something that we as a community are probably going to have to solve. I don't think that we can rely on those solutions to come from the central government. We have now, I'll take one more question, and then Nancy, I'll introduce you. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for your comments about the AAAS managed program on the Hill. Being the program manager, I walk into a lot of offices where it's the first time they're hosting a fellow. And the office has to really get used to understanding how that fellow's science or engineering or health policy, health expertise will work in that office.
Right.
So how to operationalize the skill sets that they bring
Sure.
and the expertise that they bring. So I'm wondering if GAO has in its planning, this dovetails with someone else's question earlier, has in its planning outreach to offices to help train them into how they might be using the science and engineering and health policy information that you're charged to provide.
I'm sorry, just to help me, which offices are you referring to in this case? Outreach to which offices?
Member offices,
Members,
committee
right,
offices, whomever.
Right.
We do find that there's sometimes a gap in understanding. I'm now bringing an anthropologist into my office. How is that relevant to what we're going to be doing?
Sure. Well, it turns out a lot of our work at times, especially in tech assessment, comes through a committee request, typically for GAO, but it has come through the channel of a fellow on the Hill for a while, maybe eventually become permanent staff, but for a time they're particularly there to be technical and help the member understand issues, maybe fellow colleagues, or what have you. But they've been the ones that we've connected with, and we definitely want to be as agile, nimble, and connected as we can from that dimension. When scientists are coming in our office, I have no problem or trouble giving them technical work and things to do. Work that we're doing now, for example, just in terms of what's now in the not yet, we're doing a big tech assessment on 5G. It's a large lens look, that's a major national issue. We're looking at epidemiological modeling in lieu of Zika and Ebola crises of years past, and the extent to which we can perhaps be more proactive in that particular area. We're working on superbugs, this antibiotic-resistant bacteria, on those sort of things. So I have life scientists coming on that I can throw at that particular problem. And then a score of other particular studies that have to be technical, whether we, STAA, are doing it as a tech assessment, or whether a colleague like our nuclear weapons team is doing something, we can assign scientists. There's no problem from our side on absorbing technical skill and putting it to work. Building the channel is there, but one of the other things that GAO does even without a program is there's times like I've taken staff scientists and sent them to a Hill detail, or GAO does this routinely to help out, so there's an extra augmentation, again a plus and to the Tech Congress and AAASPs. Well, we wanted to decidedly send somebody there, and building that bridge has been critical because now we have a stronger sense of what the committee needs, and we're going to continue to do that.
So with that, I want to try to keep us on time as close as we can, and our next moderator will be Nancy Ognanovich from Bloomberg. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
All right.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Well, I'm waiting for some of the panelists to come up so we can begin some of the questions.
I thought it was just going to be all you. Then I'm going to sit here.
Very good.
All right then. Well, I'm with Bloomberg Government, and I cover Congress, and I cover a lot of leadership issues and appropriations. And in the appropriations process, I've seen a renewed interest in providing more science and technology resources. And so that's been percolating in the past year or so. And so we're going to be seeing what's going on as Congress gets to work finally on these fiscal 2020 bills. And I want to introduce some of the experts here with me today. And we're kind of jumping around in order here. We have Dan Schuman, Policy Director with Demand Progress, and you're a well-known expert on government transparency issues. And reporters like me rely a lot on CRS reports, and you're responsible for making CRS reports widely available. Dr. Deborah Stein, an outside consultant, but has all kinds of experience previously in, she was with CRS. She's been with the White House. She was the executive director of what they call PCAS, which is the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology in the Obama administration. And also you were with the National Academies of Sciences. Now I have to look a ways down. We have Adam. Adam Kuiper, you co-founded New Atlantis, a publication that covers technology and society, and you're still very involved with that. And a former fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And we have Yuri Beckelman at the end. You're in Congress, you work for Congressman Takano, and I've had the pleasure of talking to him about OTA. He sponsors a bill, I believe, to bring that back. Mm-hmm. But you started out in Congresswoman Pelosi's office, I believe.
I did.
So you have a lot of experience with Congress and tracking this issue. I'd just like to kind of start out and ask, in Congress right now, where are we? We've heard talk about bringing back OTA. We've heard appropriators talk about how we needed more of an examination, or look at GAO beefing up its resources to advise Congress. Just bring us up to speed on where we are. I know I'll be covering the fiscal year 2020 ledge branch bill whenever they get that done. I don't think it's necessarily going to be in December. It could be, but if not, then maybe February, March.
Yeah.
But what's the status right now?
Well, this is the closest we've ever been, which is like very exciting. We've been working on this, on just straight funding for years and years now. As everyone knows, it still exists on the books, it just isn't funded. So we've been we've been offering it at ledge branch probes every year, getting told no, offering it as an amendment on the floor, getting closer and closer every year. And we have seen a ton of momentum on something that we were kind of working in the darkness on for a while, which is very exciting. So this is the closest we've ever gotten. House ledge branch of probes put some money in there, and we agree with the amount they put in there, because even if we gave them a full appropriation, they would never be able to spend it the first year. The idea is to ramp something up. Whether that will stay in is to be seen, but a lot of what we're doing is about momentum and creating an explanation of why it's necessary, what it would do, how it would operate in a new ecosystem. This is no longer 1994. CRS doesn't fulfill the role of Google for Congress that they used to, right? Like, we've got to update what we're doing. We've got a piece of legislation that we think would address a lot of these concerns. And so we're making that argument, and whether it happens this year or in the next few years, I think you're going to see something break, and I'm hopeful about it.
If you didn't get in the ledge branch or another appropriations bill something, with funding, what else might be there? More directive for examining the issue?
Probably not. I think that you're either going to see some entry-level funding or not. I don't think that there's going to be any more studying. I think the Napa report was kind of that compromise. I definitely have some thoughts on the Napa report, although it still kind of puts out the need for something more than we have now, which I can happily talk about more. But I think that I'm still hopeful that there's potentially will be some money in there to start it up again, and if there's not, then it will be a much larger discussion in the next Congress. That it will specifically be about whether to fund OTA again. There is this confluence of the Modernization Committee, which just got refund to continue
Extended.
on. Our office, as well as Senator Tillis in the Senate, pushing for this own agency that's updated, that is more responsive to Congress, that has shorter-term reports, that gets more buy-in from individual members, not just leadership, right? So I think it's hopeful that we'll see something either this Congress or in the next Congress.
When I first was covering this, I knew that Congressman Yoder, the Republican from Kansas, had enough interest to put it in the Republican ledge branch bill. And so there was some Republican interest. Adam and others, can you talk a little bit about whether there's bipartisan support, or if there is bipartisan interest, can you characterize it in terms of what might be acceptable to both sides ultimately?
Sure. The elephant, as it were, in the room. This is it's kind of the under-discussed question in conversations about reviving OTA or about science and technology advice to Congress. When the story of OTA is told, it's usually told as it was killed off as part of the Republican Revolution. Yeah. That's not wrong, but the question of bringing it back too rarely actually takes into account the question of the need for some kind of buy-in from the people who might go ahead and kill off something of this sort next time around if circumstances were to be anything like they were in 1994-5. So and that's a tricky question. It's tricky partly because conservatives are in an unusual state and at an unusual moment right now. There is more distrust of experts and expertise among my confreres on the right than in, well, let's just say that in a very long time. The basic conservative tendency of supporting innovation in general and of opposing regulation and opposing taxes that might step on innovation, and of being open, however, to policies and regulations that might, especially taking into some kind of ethical rationale into account, an openness to that kind of regulation. None of that has really changed, but the willingness to actually get involved into these in this specific set of fights is, even recognizing the need to bring back something like OTA, it's not really, it's not on the radar screen of members of Congress. There has been over the past few years some interest among some Republicans in strengthening Congress in generic terms and in beefing up some of its capacities. You've seen that from even the folks who were involved with what was called for a while the Article 1 project run out of the Federalist Society. But the interest in doing something to beef up its science and technology competence is very minimal. I mean, is that your sense too?
Yeah, I'd like to add a little context. So there's 3 arguments that we've been told over time about why not to bring this back. And the original was that it was some sort of tool of specific senators who ran it to kind of undermine the administration. A lot of this came out of a TA report. I don't think it was a full report on the Star Wars program. There were a lot of holdouts that were really gung-ho on never bringing it back because they didn't want to get it used against them. Almost none of them are still in Congress, so that is no longer the argument. That is
Charles Grassley.
Yeah, there were others in the House too. We were supposed to have hearings on it. There was politics involved with it. That politics doesn't exist anymore. Now it's one of 2 things. It's either this is money that we should be spending on other things, or this is going to be used as a way to continue the message around climate change, right? And the way that we're the first argument we have to make, which is that this is a saver, that this is value, that's the argument that we as people in this world have been arguing for a long time. The other argument about climate change is part of what we're offering as a reform, is that there's more buy-in from members about what's being researched and discussed, and the people who will make up some sort of tab in the future will be appointed as people who aren't looking to fight, but who are looking to come together and use TA as a valuable resource to inform Congress, not just as a way to beat each other up through science.
Dr. Stein, you were going to say?
Yeah, I wanted to give like 2 real-world examples because I'm an engineer by trade, and so we just kind of like to get to brass tacks, right? So these are 2 examples, all what happened within the past like week or so. So that really kind of struck me as examples of sort of the good and bad parts of like why we might need something like an OTA, not the OTA of back when, but let's just say a new OTA and the challenges. So the first is, as was mentioned, I used to be executive director of PCAS. There's a new PCAS that just had its first meeting yesterday under this new administration. And Edie Bernice Johnson, who is the chair of the House Science Committee, sent a letter to this PCAS asking for a study, which I thought was like amazing because, when I was at PCAS, executive director of PCAS during the Obama administration, we never got a letter. And she asked for a study as following, so I'm sort of quoting from this letter, which is basically how federal agencies can protect society against the intended and unintended misuse and abuse of artificial intelligence. Now, that in the day, I think would have been an OTA study. I do not think, as a former CRS staffer, it's very much of a CRS study. I don't really think it's a GAO new age study. I think it could be an academy study, but as mentioned in the NAPA report, one of the challenges when you're at the academy is Congress often requests studies and authorization bills, but yet fails to provide appropriations for them, which can make it very challenging for a study to move forward. But I think that it's an example to say, okay, hey, there are things out there that are OTA-like things that somebody wants. Yet I find it remarkable that she is asking a Trump-era PCAST, which, at least in my mind, has less expertise, and she's referring to in this letter to a Obama-era PCAST as an example of a good report, which was on like forensic science. But it's not the same PCAST, of course. There's different members on it. So anyhow, I just want to give that as a real-world example. Okay, and then here's an example of almost the opposite, where in this case, this is this is Agent Orange. Now, I happened to when I first got out of engineering school, I was a mathematician for the Air Force, looking at the impact of Agent Orange on Vietnam vets. And I actually, part of my job was to look at the records and see the pictures of every Vietnam vet and check the files and so forth. So it has some personal relevance to me. And so 2 years ago, the secretary of the VA said we should add certain diseases to the list.
This was talked about a lot last week in the Senate.
Yes, exactly. Certain diseases to the list. The Academy has done any number of studies over the years, saying that yes, these diseases should be added. The secretary of the VA said yes. It was then opposed, as I understand it, by OMB, and then the chair of the VA opposed it for these 80,000 veterans, saying that science was needed to justify the spending of the tax dollars. Yet, I think if you looked at the consensus of the science, it would say the science is sufficient, but now they're supposedly waiting for 2 more studies. But of course, the challenge with science is, there's always another study.
Well, this has become a budgetary issue and a political issue.
Right, and so I think it's an example of, the challenges of an OTA.
My boss is the chair of Veterans Affairs. I know very well about the issue.
Okay, well, good. Then you know exactly what I'm talking about, and maybe you can talk about it more than I can.
Well, this points to the problem with the polarization, and the politics that could affect bringing back an OTA or any other kind of an entity. Well, Dan, what do you think about these proposals and like what was discussed this morning, and trying to augment what we have or creating this new, and I've got to get my mouth around this, the new word, OXTA.
So I want to start by maybe suggesting a different name for it. We could probably just move the, I'm going to call it COAST from now, which has all the same letters.
Oh, that's
So
right.
the Congressional Office of the Advisor for Science and Technology, just because I cannot say OXTA or whatever. It sounds like OXIT,
Looks good on paper, though.
Which is a former EGOV office, and I will get the two confused forever, so I can't do that. So I think there were a couple things that were notable. The first is the first chapter in this report makes clear what we've all known, but has been difficult to say, which is that Congress has basically destroyed its internal capacity to do work. There's 2,000 fewer people at GAO, there's 20% fewer people at CRS. House committees are down by 1,000 staff over the last 25 years. This goes on and on and on and on and on. Congress has destroyed its ability to do its job. And that means that it's easier for lobbyists like me to go and try to persuade them to do things. But it's very hard for them to proactively set forth their own agendas. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. But there's been an effort to destroy Congress's ability to determine what the facts are and to analyze them on a reasonable basis. There are people who have been fighting valiant rearguard actions on this for a very long time, including GAO, which is built up an amazing sort of arm focused on trying to figure out what's sort of going on in the world. That sort of brings to the second thing, which is that the GAO entity is going to persist in some fashion. Like this function is not going to end.
And it should.
And nor should it, right? So I'm trying to do the political side, not the odd side is a whole other side. But it's gonna persist. But also is like every analysis, including the NAPA analysis, says that there is something that's missing, right? Some people call it horizon scanning. Some people call it foresight. There's for futurism. Like there's a lot of different words for it. But there is something that is kind of missing in this space. And the third is that it's very difficult for members of Congress and their staff to sort of get answers to the questions that they have, and also to be informed about what they should know and to understand the information that they're receiving. And this is part of a broader fight. Now, you started at the beginning talking about funding levels, which is the most boring thing to talk about.
They won't increase staffing levels or pay staffers more money, or they'll get into trouble.
That's right. And there's a fight, as you know, right now, over the most boring concept on earth, which is the 302B allocations. How much money goes to each of the 12 appropriation subcommittees? Mm-hmm. The House's number for Ledge Branch is lower than the Senate's by $81 million for no reason. We're talking about increasing federal spending by billions of dollars. I forget what it's 20 to $30 billion.
Overall for defense and non-defense, but when you get down to the resources for the Congress, they have to keep the pay freeze for the members and not increase money for staff.
Exactly right. But they don't have, the question about member pay is a particularly dangerous one. But when you look at staff pay, staff are paid less than their counterparts were paid 10, 20, 25 years ago. They can't retain scientists. They can't retain technologists. You had the Sergeant at Arms testifying in the House earlier this year saying that they can't maintain people for cybersecurity to protect the House because they can't fund them, and they're afraid that with Amazon coming here, they're going to steal even more of their technologists. So there is this push where you get to about 30 years old, right, and maybe you meet that special someone. You don't want to live in a group house anymore, and you leave the Hill, right? Like that is what happens,
reality.
right? That is the reality of living in Washington. I came here in 2001. I had I shared a house in a neighborhood. It was $500 a month for rent, right? Like that doesn't exist in this world at all anymore. And when you look to the fact that the Capitol Police are paid more on average than the average Hill staffer,
That budget is going way up.
which the Capitol Police budget has tripled in the last 20 years. It's $450 million, up from 100 and something. And they have 2,300 staff over there. And you compare that to the investments in terms of the Congress, the legislative stuff, which has gone down. There is the pushback that has finally happened. I remember Darrell Issa, back when he was chairman of the Oversight Committee, talking about that he couldn't hire and retain the staff that he needed. And when Elijah Cummings testified earlier this year before House Admin, he said that he was down 25 staff on the House Oversight Committee, like 25 slots. Like they just couldn't fill those spots because they didn't have the money to do it. And I think the Select Committee, in part, is a recognition that this is a problem.
Well, the Select Committee, I think, just had its time extended to the end of next year, to the end of the Congress. And so those are some of the issues that they'll be looking at.
And they're having wonderful conversations and bringing in staff to have those conversations and really listening to frontline and senior. It's really a wonderful thing that program is doing, the committee is doing.
Yeah, I just want to add like one other thing on the personnel issue, which I think is important. Like when I got hired at CRS, I had been at the Academy for a very long time, and the person, and so I was basically a specialist in science and technology policy, and I was hired at the GS 15 level, which is at a high level, and at the same time, another person was hired also at the GS 15 level. And the reason we were hired was because both of us had like literally decades of experience in science technology policy, and so we knew a lot of people, and so like I could start on day one, and I had congressional people contacting me saying, would you do study ABC, like from the day that I started, right? But now what's happening, and it was starting when I was there, and it's just like, think even more now, is they're hiring people at much lower levels, right? And the reason why, of course, is, because they're a lot cheaper. And so, when you hire somebody at, say, a GS 13 level, whether they have a PhD or don't have a PhD, and really the staff that I dealt with, that I was with at CRS, almost all of them had PhDs in various scientific fields. So I think expertise in terms of science was not an issue. But as I think people know, at least I'm probably sure most of the people in this room know, it's more than your expertise, right? It's a lot of the people you know, and also you got to know the nuances of data, and you got to know the history and so forth. And as somebody who I ran the Marzine Fellowship Program for its first 10 years at the National Academies. I've dealt with, people straight out of PhD programs for a long time, and they have a lot to learn, right? Which is fine. But I think it's really important not to just say, okay, it's a certain number of FTEs or having a certain degree, because it's more than that if you want to do it. So when I was, for example, looking at the NAPA report, I didn't feel that aspect was there, right? You need to really pair, senior people like me who can mentor junior people. And I was mentored by people. I'm sure you guys have all mentored people who were junior, and you groom them to sort of take your place or to move on to other offices and take those senior positions. And I don't think, I think that's a real challenge. So when you're looking at, like, for example, saying, okay, well, we're going to have a scientific and technical expert for each committee, well, yeah, but let's just talk about who. So the first thing is keep in mind that science and technology is not like one person, I mean, that's the first thing, right? I get mad because I'm an engineer and people say science all the time, and I'm thinking, okay, yeah, don't forget me, the engineer, right? So that's sort of the first thing. And then who you can have? You're going to have someone who just graduated from the AAAS fellowship program. Well, they haven't had those sort of decades of experience, all those ties, all those different things. So that would really sort of worry me a bit. And so it's one thing to be a facilitator in that position, and it's another thing to have sort of those decades of experience. So what would that position description be? So there's a lot of parts I like about the NAPA report, but when it comes to implementation, there's a lot of things where I'd like a lot more thought to go into it.
Adam?
I just want to kind of piggyback on that. I mean, the NAPA report, such as it is a very impressive achievement. It's just extraordinarily difficult to put together something like this after so many people that you call up say, "I'm sorry, I'm too busy." It's for what it is. It's very a very impressive example of its genre, but it's also kind of captive to some of its own metaphors, including the very common metaphor of thinking of members of Congress as consumers or clients. You see that in a lot of talk about GAO and CRS also. It's obviously also language very common to the intelligence community and how it deals with the people that it informs. And some of the other metaphors throughout the report, like this whole idea of absorption, which has these metaphors have some value, but they also in some ways can blind us to some of the broader work that OTA did that is left kind of under-addressed here. I don't just mean the kind of horizon scanning, futurism, whatever one wants to call that, although that is very important. I'm glad the NAPA report addresses that. A lot of the old OTA staffers would say something along the lines to me over the years. They said something like, there's lots of places that you could go for information about wolf at the door problems. OTA can help you think about termites in the basement problems. I always like that. That's helpful. But it's not just that. There's other work that OTA did that really doesn't quite get captured here. And I want to kind of see if I can zero in on that so that I could maybe suggest that something closer to a beefed up, not just in GAO, but a beefed up, separate, freestanding technology assessment, or whatever one wants to rename that activity function, is preferable to the kind of the model that's suggested in the NAPA report. Part of what OTA did, I have tended to think of it as a kind of fact checker function. This is stuff that's similar to what you can get out of the best of what GAO and CRS have done when they've tried to do tech work. That sometimes means, though, not just looking at where the trend lines are going, but something that OTA in particular did very well, throwing cold water on the promises and expectations of people in the S&T world, and also on some of the enthusiasms of members of Congress. That's really helpful, and that requires the kind of experience that you're talking about, the kind of stuff you can't just get if you're a newly minted PhD just coming to the Hill wide-eyed and looking around, or if you're especially cynical. In its role as a kind of translator, OTA was able to bridge gaps between policy and S&T in a way that, again, GAO and CRS can do some of that, but by bringing in their stakeholders in the way that OTA did, with a kind of openness, OTA was able to do that in a much richer way. And then I guess in its last function, the way I think of it, and again, maybe I'm victim to my own metaphors, in its function as a kind of journalistic entity, OTA was doing something that journalists do. It was not just going out and saying, what stakeholders do we have to talk to, as in, let's check off this box and this box, we have to talk to somebody from this business community, talk to somebody from... No, they had an openness to discovery as part of the technology assessment model that resulted in reports that were distinctly humane, that were not simply reports dictated by the science and technology, nor by just the needs of a member of Congress saying, here's what we need specifically for this policy process and here are the metrics we need, but rather by an openness to a kind of set of concerns of people, including ethical concerns, that you don't see in government reports generally, and that when you think of the products, no offense to our esteemed friend from GAO, when you think of what comes out of CRS and GAO, you don't especially think in terms of this kind of rich, humane, maybe even open to ethical discussion kind of product. They can do it, they have kind of touched on it, but so many of the important questions in science and technology today and in the foreseeable future taking into account that our foresight is very limited, are questions that have important, deeply important ethical components. And a revived technology assessment function in a freestanding entity, something like OTA, renamed however you want to, could be a home for that kind of work in a way that I don't think the recommendation of the Napa report really allows. And I would just finally add, that's
Before
also
we
the
run
sort of
out of
thing
time.
conservatives might be more interested in supporting and sustaining.
About being humane, I mean, the environment, the political environment on the Hill is so rough. And I'm wondering if proposals that come from the presidential trail, such as Elizabeth Warren suggesting bringing back OTA, help or hurt an effort. Dan, do you have any observations or?
I think the more it's talked about, the better. I don't necessarily think that it matters the details of any of the presidential proposals along those lines. I think the broad acknowledgement within part of the field that there is something that is lacking in Congress, which I think most people think, provides the political support to do something, although what that something is not entirely clear.
And Andrew Yang was the first to write it in his platform. I just want to put that.
That's true.
So we have two presidential candidates who have endorsed it.
Yeah, can I just make one more point, which
Yes.
is not, which is just related to this,
Quickly.
Rich, is really quick. Is one of the things that that the Napa report did not include, but is related to this ethical issue, is that I think it ignored the literally 1,000 or so FACA committees that are out there, Federal Advisory Committee Act things. And so I actually did a study when I was at the Academy of all the different FACA committees that relate to science technology and different aspects of it. And when I was at PCAST, I did ones that relate to nanotechnology. I also worked recently on a study that was done for the New Futures Institute about carbon dioxide reduction technology and the need for ethical aspects for that. And thinking about the National Science and Technology Council. So I think it's important to not forget that we have a giant infrastructure out there that Congress already has access to that can produce some of these things, right? Now, most of those committees would be quite happy. There's already money out there in some cases to run them, but they have also been in decline. So I think when we're talking about expertise availability for Congress, or as I think you were talking about the very depressing initial chapter, those committees have also lost a lot of funding as well, and there's been a lot of challenges to them in this general expertise. But I don't think we should forget about them, and we need to think about how they should be part of this process, maybe part of this, if there is this office formed, which I do kind of like the concept of having a congressional science advisor kind of position. Let's think about those FACA committees.
Can I jump in and just offer one last thing? Because I would like to kind of give the on-the-ground Congress's view of the Napa report from my perspective. I often am on panels and following or on with Tim, and I just want to I use all of this stuff. Our office uses all of this stuff. We have a Tech Congress fellow. We have multiple requests into GAO. I've requested so many things from CRS that I have a binder that's all been written for me. I love this stuff, but the reality is on the ground there is still a gap. And I want to give you a few examples across the spectrum, right? I've been trying to go after Tech Congress and AAAS fellows for a long time, and I finally got my first one, partially because my boss is a little higher profile as a chairman. If we want to get real technology understanding, it needs to not just be in the people who are the chairs of the committees of jurisdiction, or frankly the Senate, because the Senate is a lot sexier, and I always lose out to Senate, So that's a reality of what's happening on the ground, right? And if we're still getting technical advice from GAO, which is really wonderful, but at the same time, offices don't always feel like that's where they're supposed to be going for this type of advice, or they feel like since they aren't a chairman, they're not going to get the type of advice that they want, or the GAO has this history of accounting, and no one wants accountants to come into Congress, right? And maybe that's a misperception, but the reality is it doesn't exist. And when it comes to the Napa report, I think that they highlighted that desirability was what they were going to focus on, and then they didn't. They focused on what they thought was feasible, and I don't believe that it was Napa's job to decide what Congress can defend and what they can't defend. It is our job to set that up. We wanted a report on what we wanted, and if you ask members of Congress, they will tell you that they want deliverable product, they want good advice that comes quickly, and that, yes, they want more technologists to be coming in,
Plus, they would also like advice on how to use technology, which I don't think is part of technology assessment, but that is what they want. Those are the 4 things that I think people want, and it is our job to figure out how to defend it. I can tell you right now that this Office of Science Technology Advisor is much less defendable than an OTA that's set up with a bipartisan board that people who are part of it defend, people who use it defend. It's just much less realistic.
Okay. I think we're supposed to have some questions from those who are attending here. I'll wait for the microphone to come around. Oh.
I can just speak loudly.
All right, please go ahead, and then we'll come back.
I don't think it can be captured by the recording that way, though. Sorry.
Oh, here she comes now.
It's a standoff.
Thank you. I've got a question about the politicization conversation. I'm wondering if you almost don't want to talk about some of the science and tech issues that still are bipartisan, or if you're risking that, but it does seem like there are some science and tech issues that still have some bipartisanship. Artificial intelligence, scrutiny of big tech companies from administration and Congress. Are some of those recent conversations, could those potentially yield bipartisan support for an OTA-like office, and we're just waiting for those issues to percolate more, like some of the more political issues like climate change that have been around and discussed for a little longer? Like, are we just waiting for the bipartisanship to bear fruit?
Absolutely. Criminal justice was one that could have used an OTA, frankly. There are a lot of algorithms that went into criminal justice reform that could have used a lot more advising going into it, and I think you would find that across the board. We're working on something called forensic algorithms with GAO right now, and I think and understanding it is important, and getting advice on that. Where my boss always cites is that during the San Bernardino shooting, he had 2 sides telling him information that was in conflict, that Apple was telling him it was technically impossible to put in a backdoor on encryption, and the FBI saying that Apple had to put it, and neither of those are correct, right? If we put a backdoor on encryption, technically you can do it. Would it have larger implications to what encryption is? Absolutely, but neither side was willing to honestly admit that, and we needed some quick tech advice on how that would actually work.
Can I understand that? Because there's the inverse problem, which is that part of what came from that was there was an effort to create a commission to look at questions of encryption. And we and many others tried to kill it, and we did. Because we didn't trust a thing that would be created. Because we didn't know who was going to be on it. It had no track record. It wasn't trustworthy. And this happens again and again. There's an issue, so you try to get a bunch of people together, issue report, and it comes, there isn't a trusted place that could have done that, and that's part of what's trying to be solved here. So it's the flip side of that problem.
And we do have some bipartisanship. We have, on our reform bill, we have Elise Stefanik is in the House, has sponsored our reform bill, and Senator Tillis is a real champion for this in the Senate. And in the past, every single year, we had Republicans vote for our amendment that would have added more funding to OTA. It increased every year, and it's going to continue to increase.
Sir?
Sure. So Tim Persons, GAO. Thanks to the panelists. Great discussion. Adam, I appreciate the constructive feedback. Read the AI report, our Artificial Intelligence for 2018. We had Elsie in there, Ethical, Legal, Social.
I did read it.
Let us know how we could dial it up. It's a key goal for GAO to always get better. So that's just an invitation. But the question really is for the panel. Let's just, again, this is like mathematical order of operations. Let's not start with governance structures first. If you take the NAPA approach, which is absorptive, what are the things we're trying to solve? I just want to try and, Yuri was starting to do this, and I love working with Yuri. I hope we continue to do this. So I was invite Yuri to add on, or other panelists on, how do you, from the absorptive, consumptive side of things, solving from that direction rather than let's erect another entity per se, right? That could be the solution, but how do you get into the absorptive side of things beyond just maybe some more fellows and more production side stuff, which is what I'm hearing is let's just produce more stuff.
Yeah, and right. I always like saying this too, right, is that if OTA was passed and stood up and fully funded, would it fix Congress's ability to understand technology? Not completely, right? That's the whole point. There's no magic. bullet here, there's this like large scale structure we need to create that has more technologists coming to Congress who can be paid and who want to stay, and then filling out all of these. There's more than enough work to go around is what we always say, including at CRS, which will just pick up the phone and have a quick conversation with you. Congress feels very comfortable having that conversation with CRS because they know it will be delivered in a quick turnaround. However, they will not get policy. They will not get policy recommendations in a CRS bill. They will get, well, if you wanted to get here, I guess you could use this, but it's not as simple as you could introduce this piece of legislation. And that is a huge, glaring gap. One of the things that as we started discussing what does Congress want, where is this gap, is that we want an OTA that didn't exist that can offer policy prescriptions based on what you are asking for, not just on what they think after writing this report. And this is the bigger picture of if you want to create systems, you have to stop and think about what people want and how they use it, not just how you think they should use it, right?
Well, I mean, as a CRS staffer at one point, I would say just, you have to keep in mind that is what CRS is allowed to do by Congress, right?
And by CRS management, which is different from what Congress requires, as a former CRS staffer as well.
Okay, so these are like, so they're allowed to do options, but, I think CRS reports also say, well, this is what, this is what the National Academies recommends. This is what so-and-so recommends. So there are recommendations that are out there. So when you're being asked, which you often are, you're being asked, for your personal opinion. There's no reason necessarily why you should ask for my personal opinion, because I'm just sort of bringing together lots of different things. I think on the communication side, I should say, like after I left the White House, I went to Carnegie Mellon, and like I said, I was a professor in general public policy, and I started to produce videos that were like less than 3 minutes, that were on peer-reviewed research, and to get sort of the key messages out there. And I think that, those kind of short videos for someone who just wants like a quick flash, and to get the key point, I think those are really helpful because they have visuals, and so I think they're better than podcast. I think like your eyes start to glaze over on these one-pagers. You can show data. You can do an awful lot of things. I think RAND does a good job with these. So I am really a big fan of trying to do things visually. One really good graphic can make a world of difference.
We can rename GAO the Good Audio Visual.
Yes, to try. To try and do, and I should say, and then also do more workshops and things like that. Things that Yes.
And can I, so 4 things really quick, and I'll do it really quick because I know we're out. One is something you can't do anything about, which is that there needs to be more congressional staff. They need to get paid more. That's outside your scope. Second is better integration of the multiple sources of information. So you've got GAO reports over here, CRS reports over here. You've got the 1,000 federal advisory committees. You've got like all these other places to get this. You don't necessarily know where it is. You don't, most staffers don't know how to find this.
As a staffer, when I hear that, I just am like, I don't care anymore. I'm not digging through any of this, right? It gives me anxiety.
It's got to be spoon-fed, right? Like if it's not designed. The other is look where people go. Like one of the most terrible things that when you look at any issue of consequence, when you look at what most staff do, what do? They Google it, right? Mm-hmm. And when they Google something, what's the first thing they end up on Wikipedia. Mm-hmm. Right? So, the National Archives has a Wikipedian residence, right? Like, go and infuse the stuff where people are going to find it, and you have your links in the bottom. Like, that.
And if I could just say one thing with Wikipedia. Yeah. Wikipedia, in case you don't know, has an educational foundation. And so I had my students at Carnegie Mellon go and modify, as part of their class assignments, Wikipedia to update it and make corrections on the data and the analysis. And because a lot of people do go to Wikipedia. And so instead of being told, which all faculty tell students, don't go to Wikipedia, instead, Wikipedia has a whole program under their foundation to improve the quality of Wikipedia. So I agree totally. Wikipedia, integrated in,
we have time for only another question or two. Would you?
Daniel, I really appreciate what you said, and I want to build on that. Because I was thinking about that same thing, and I'm wondering, and maybe, Yuri, particularly for you, there is so much out there. and the rapid response piece. And at the same time, I think maybe, I hope we all know, you look at something on Wikipedia, do you actually know whether you can trust it? Is there some sort of, would it be helpful to have sort of like the human Wikipedia or the human conduit, where as a staffer, you can call that person, and I'm not saying instead of OTA or what GAO is doing, but that there are some of them there who, like, their whole job is to actually know, where do I point this staffer? This is their question, and I'm going to point them towards this FACA committee, this university, this technical person, this science person, because my job is to keep track of who has the best validated, vetted info to answer that question. And I'm just curious, because I think there is that human touch, that curated piece that can be so valuable. Is that totally off base, or would that be?
In a dream world, absolutely, right? So I'll give you an example. Right now we have a Tech Congress fellow who worked on an issue that had been sitting and languishing in our office for a long time on forensic algorithms. And it was a very complicated, detailed piece that I had CRS write something on. It was very useful, but they could only provide me a legalistic view of it, of cases that had been tried using forensic algorithms, right? And there wasn't any technical advisors we could go to. We ended up having more conversations with technical advisors and with the legal community, but I didn't have the bandwidth to do that. I never would have had the bandwidth to do it. So it languished for 2 years, and I bring on this Tech Congress fellow who's wonderful, who probably set up in the range of 20 to 30 phone calls with specialty advisors and experts on this, and kind of was able to put together all of their research, understand the technology to a baseline where she could send it to GAO to do a more in-depth look at it, get it accepted, and begin this conversation and get more people involved. But as a Hill staffer, I never would have gotten around to that level of detail. Even if I had been given a list, I never would have been able to. We just have so much on our plate. I have like a major hearing going on right now that I'm like worried about when I'm done, because I've been getting all the buzzes about, right? Like, that's why it would be wonderful to have more science and technology advisors and more staff and more people who could really drill into this stuff. Absolutely.
I think we're out of time. I just want to say I had the opportunity to talk to Newt Gingrich a couple months back about bringing back OTA. And he said members of Congress have Google. They don't necessarily need OTA today. They have all the resources they need on their desk. I think that's really simplifying it, but that was an interesting, comment.
He told someone else the National Academy should be doing this, and as a Hill staffer, I've never reached out to the National Academies to give me technical advice on something. It's CRS or GAO.
Well, we'll see where Congress goes in the approach process and with the Select Committee on Modernization and other ways, and we'll keep tracking it over the next year or so. Well, thank you, everybody,
so much
for being here today. It's very good.
Well, that's it for our programming today. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I also want to give a quick shout out to Rush Holt, who advanced this issue for many years in Congress after the OTA was defunded. And I also want to draw some attention to a couple upcoming events. On December 3rd, we're organizing a civil society kind of coalition meeting, Chatham House Rule, to get everyone together to talk about sort of agenda for the coming year. And the Levin Center also has an event on December 6th, which is a big symposium on science and tech expertise in Congress in the morning on Capitol Hill, which you should all definitely go to. Otherwise, thank you all for coming here, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.